Jewish Meditation by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, a practical guide.
Chapter 9 Nothingness. Meditation on nothingness is a topic upon which I have touched briefly in an earlier chapter. Actually, this is a very advanced type of meditation and not for beginners. It is not recommended for practice without the guidance of a spiritual master and should never be practiced alone. I shall discuss it here because this technique is closely related to visualization methods and is important for understanding a number of other areas in Jewish meditation and mysticism. Once proficiency has been achieved in visualization techniques, it is possible to attempt to visualize pure nothingness. Nothingness has no counterpart in the real world, so one must be able to create a perception of it in the mind. It is a useful technique to attain closeness to God and to achieve a realization of the self. As in the case of other advanced techniques, this can be extremely dangerous. The reason why it should never be practiced alone is that one can get swallowed up in the nothingness of the meditation and not be able to return. Therefore, one should always have a partner or a spiritual master available to bring one back to objective reality. Before we can begin to discuss this type of meditation, we must have an idea of what nothingness looks like. When one first thinks of nothingness, one may image it as being like the blackness of empty space. The interplanetary void may seem as close to nothingness as a person can imagine. If one is expert in visualization, it is fairly easy to visualize empty space and pure empty blackness. This indeed may be a first step toward visualizing nothingness, but it is not nothingness. Space is space, and blackness is blackness. Neither is nothingness. A next step in attempting to visualize nothingness would be to attempt to visualize pure, transparent, empty space without any background color. One can imagine oneself looking into a pure, colorless, transparent crystal with the transparency extending to infinity. According to some commentaries, this is the connotations of the brickwork of sapphire that the Israelites saw under God's feet, Exodus 24:10. These commentaries translate the Hebrew expression Livanath HaSapir as transparency of crystal, rather than brickwork of sapphire. They say that it is related to the meditation in which one images pure transparency without any color. One images first the transparency of crystal and then the transparency of pure colorless empty space. One way to do this is to image the air in front of you. It is, of course, perfectly transparent and therefore you cannot see it. Instead, you see what is at the other end of the room. Using the hewing technique described in the previous chapter, you should be able to rid yourself of the image of the other end of the room. Then you will have a pure image of the transparent air around you. It will be pure transparency with no form or color. Years ago, I found this to be a very helpful technique for experiencing the presence of God. It is an important teaching of Judaism that God is omnipresent, totally filling all creation. The clearest statement of this is the verse, "The whole world is filled with His glory," Isaiah 6:3. God fills all creation and is even present in the air around us. I would therefore contemplate the air around me and imagine it filled with God's presence. This would bring a very great feeling of God's closeness. Now, although this technique involves imaging the transparent empty space, what is imaged is still space. It is not nothingness. So what does nothingness look like? It is taught that nothingness is what you see behind your head. Of course, sight does not extend behind the head. Therefore, what you see behind the head is nothing. In other words, you see nothingness. This teaching can be used as a contemplation. Attempt to contemplate what you see behind your head. You realize that it is nothing, but with practice, you will be able to make it into an object of contemplation. This is a powerful technique to gain a conception of pure nothingness. In the Bible, it appears that this or a similar technique was used as a precursor of prophecy. There are a number of references to voices and prophecy seeming to come from behind. Thus, Ezekiel said, "I heard behind me a loud voice proclaiming, 'Blessed be God's glory from his place,' Ezekiel 3:12. Likewise, regarding a certain degree of revelation, the prophet said, 'Your ears shall hear a voice behind you,' Isaiah 30:21. This might indicate that by meditating on the nothingness seen behind the head, one opens oneself up to the experience of prophecy. Other sources, however, indicate that instead of contemplating what one sees behind the head, one should contemplate what one sees inside the head. This is a method discussed by Rabbi Abraham Abulafia, one of the most important writers on Kabbalistic meditation. Of course, what one sees inside the head is also nothingness, so the experience is essentially the same. To learn how to visualize nothingness properly can take years. It is not an easy discipline. However, once one has a good depiction of nothingness, one can use it as a powerful visualization technique. Of all the images one can visualize, the purest is a vision of nothingness. Visualizing nothingness is also a technique used in the most advanced meditational exercises. If one visualizes nothingness and at the same time clears the mind of thought, the mind becomes a total blank. The mind is then at its most sensitive, open to even the most ethereal experiences. This is therefore an important technique for experiencing the spiritual. This can sometimes be a traumatic experience when one locks the mind onto a visualization of nothingness and clears the consciousness of all other thought. The mind becomes so sensitive that even the slightest sensation can be overwhelming. It is like turning up a radio to full volume so that the softest voice becomes a roar. On the other hand, it is only at full volume that the weakest signals can be heard. At this level, even the random thoughts that tug at the corner of the mind are felt as mental earthquakes. Before one can proceed, one must dampen all thought completely. Finally, when all thought is quieted, one can have an experience of the spiritual. This involves a deep feeling of awe, shame, and humility. Some Kabbalists teach that this is the mystery of Ezekiel's vision. At the very beginning of his vision, the prophet says, I looked and saw a storm wind coming from the north, a great cloud and flashing fire. Ezekiel 1:4. The Zohar teaches that the wind, the cloud, and the fire are the three barriers through which a prophet must pass before he enters the realm of the divine. The first thing that Ezekiel experienced was a storm wind. There is a double meaning here, however, since the Hebrew word for wind is ruach, which also means spirit. Therefore, what Ezekiel saw can also be translated as a stormy spirit. The stormy spirit relates to the first experience mentioned earlier. When there is literally nothing in the mind, all the natural agitations of the mind are greatly intensified. This is the barrier of the storm wind through which the prophet must pass. The second barrier the prophet encounters is a great cloud. This is the muffling and restriction of all thought, an opaqueness of the mind in which nothing can be seen or experienced. It is a barrier that can easily discourage the prophet if he does not have the will to proceed further. As he is trying to ascend, he faces a cloud barrier beyond which he cannot see, and which he must strive to overcome. The final barrier is the flashing fire. This is the sense of awe, shame, and dread that the prophet experiences when he first breaks into the spiritual realm. Throughout the Bible, fire is a metaphor for shame and dread. Fire burns, and hence is an overabundance of sensation, a sensation so intense that it cannot be tolerated. Thus, while the cloud is the obliteration of sensation, the fire is the opposite, the overabundance of sensation. The cloud also shows the prophet that one who is unworthy will not see anything, while the fire demonstrates that such a person may be in danger as well. This is the manner in which meditation on nothingness opens the door to prophecy. It can also be used to get in touch with the innermost self. This, of course, raises the question, what is the nature of the self? Normally, when a person thinks of himself, the first thing he thinks of is his body. It is almost a reflex action. Ask a person to point to himself, and he will almost inevitably point to his chest. Perhaps if he is more perceptive, he will point to his head, the seat of his brain, seeing the mind as being more representative of the self than the body. The Kabbalists point out that the body is not the self. Since I can speak of my body, the body cannot be me. The body is mine, something associated with me, but the ultimate me is something much more profound than the body. Using the same argument, I can also speak of my mind. Indeed, I speak of my mind just as I speak of my body. This would imply that just as the body is not the real me, the mind is also not the real me. Carrying the argument a step further, I can even speak of my soul. This would imply that even the soul is not the real me. This being the case, the question of selfhood becomes very difficult indeed. What is the real me? A hint to the answer can be found in the Hebrew word for I, ani, aleph nun yud. It is significant to note that if the letters of ani are rearranged, they spell the word ain or ayin, aleph yud nun, which denotes nothingness. This would seem to imply that the real me is the nothingness within me. This can be understood in a fairly straightforward manner. The real me is my sense of volition, is the intangible will that impels me to do whatever I decide to do. Even if I think, I must first will myself to think. In that sense, will is even higher than thought. It is obvious that it is the I that tells my mind to think. However, the fact that I must will myself to think implies that the source of my will is on a level that is beyond thought. It is therefore impossible for me to imagine the source of my will, and there is no category in my conscious mind into which it will fit. Therefore, when I try to imagine the source of my will, the real me, all I can depict is nothingness. This can also be understood in another manner. Earlier, I mentioned that there are three things that appear to be identifiable with the self: body, mind, and soul. As I noted, neither the body, the mind, nor the soul is the self. However, in another sense, the self is a combination of body, mind, and soul. The three together appear to define the self. However, this has an important ramification. If body is not the self, and mind is not the self, and soul is not the self, but the combination of the three is, then the definition of the self is still an enigma. It would seem that it is possible to remove the body, remove the mind, and remove the soul, and still have some spark of the self. But when body, mind, and soul are removed, all that remains is nothingness. Again, it appears that the self is nothingness. It is not nothingness because of lack of existence. Rather, it is nothingness because of the lack of a category in the mind in which to place it. It is very much like the situation of what one sees behind one's head. One sees nothingness, not because there isn't anything there, but because one does not have eyes behind the head to see with. When there is no sense organ or no category in the mind to grasp certain information, then that information is perceived as nothingness. If there is no other information competing with it, then it is an experience of pure nothingness. This can also be understood in a deeper manner. If the most basic ingredient of self is will, then this must also be connected to the divine will. In this sense, a person's will comes from the spark of the divine in the person. Therefore, when a person visualizes nothingness, he is to some degree in touch with the divine within himself. This can be understood on the basis of Kabbalistic teachings that the highest spiritual levels can be understood only in terms of nothingness. This may seem difficult to understand. To comprehend it, one must understand how Judaism in general and the Kabbalists in particular view God. People often say that God is a spirit, or that God is power, or that God is love, but the fact is that none of these sentences is true. Actually, the sentence God is ... is a statement that cannot be completed. To complete the sentence would be to place God in the same category as something else. If one understands the true nature of God, then this is impossible. This truth is derived from the very basic Jewish teaching that God is the creator of all things. This has very important implications. For one, it means that even concepts as basic as will or mind are creations of God. Indeed, the Zohar explicitly states that God does not have will or mind in any anthropomorphic sense. Rather, in order to use will and mind to create the world, God first had to create these concepts. To say otherwise would be to imply that will and mind are co-equal with God, which again is impossible. Even logic itself must be seen as something created by God. Were this not so, and if we were to insist that God be bound by logic, then we would have to say that logic is higher than God, or more fundamental. Again, if we look at God as the creator of all things, then God must also be the creator of logic. This has important ramifications. If one discovers paradoxes in relation to God, it is not a problem. Paradoxes are merely ideas that transcend logic, and since God is the creator of logic, he can use it as he desires, but he is not bound by it. Of course, it is taught that God bound himself by logic when he created the world, but this was a voluntary act and not something intrinsic. The fact that God created every category means that anything for which a word exists in the human language must of necessity denote something created by God. Even the word God itself denotes our conception of him, and not his true essence. Since everything conceivable, including any category of thought that the mind can imagine, was created by God, there is nothing conceivable that can be associated with him. Let us say that I want to think about God. There is, however, no category in my mind in which I can place him. Therefore, trying to depict God is like trying to see without eyes. When I try to see where there are no eyes, all I see is nothing. Similarly, when I try to think about God, all my mind can depict is nothing. The Zoharic literature addresses this by declaring to God, no thought can grasp you at all. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, 1745 through 1813, one of the greatest Jewish mystics, notes that the Zohar uses the expression for grasp that is usually associated with a physical object. He explains, just as a hand cannot grasp thought, so the mind cannot grasp God. Our physical senses cannot grasp or detect thought, and therefore experience it as nothing. The same is true of the way the mind experiences God. Hence, the closest one can come to thinking about God is to depict nothingness and to realize that behind it is God. It is for this reason that nothingness meditation was seen as a means of drawing close to God. This is not to say that we cannot speak about God at all. As the major Jewish philosophers point out, statements we make about God are either attributes of action, stating what God does, or negative attributes, saying what God is not. We may say that God is good, kind, loving, and omnipotent. However, these are all descriptions of what God does and how he acts, but not what he is. It is important to realize that although we cannot speak about God, it is very easy to speak to God. Indeed, this is the subject of the following chapters. When a person imagines nothingness, he should realize that this is the closest that it is possible to come to imagining God. Most certainly, this does not mean that God is nothingness. In every possible way, God is more real than anything else that exists. However, it means that since there is nothing in the human mind that can relate to God as he actually is, nothingness is the closest thing to a perception of God that we can obtain. When a person depicts nothingness, he must realize that behind the nothingness is God. There is a method to image this. The technique consists in imaging the four letters of the Tetragrammaton, as in Chapter 8. However, when one hews away the surrounding imagery, instead of replacing it with white fire, one replaces it with nothingness. One begins by imaging a small area of nothingness at the edge of the yud. This area of nothingness is expanded until it totally surrounds the four letters. The first few times that one attempts this, the letters may seem to be surrounded by transparent space. With practice, one can actually make the letters seem to be surrounded by nothingness. If the letters are suspended in nothingness, there will appear to be nothing around them. In essence, the letters will fill the entire field of vision. Still, the letters are not warped or distorted in any way. Rather, the space between them and around them is filled with nothingness. Of course, it is impossible to imagine this unless one has actually experienced it. Like panoscopic vision or synesthesia, it is something that cannot be described. Another, even more advanced technique is to see the letters of the tetragrammaton behind the nothingness. Then the letters are, as it were, hidden by nothingness, just as God himself is. In a sense, this is similar to panoscopic vision. One sees nothingness, but one is simultaneously looking behind it, where one sees the letters of the divine name. All of these techniques are described or alluded to in the Kabbalah literature. However, let me repeat that the techniques described in this chapter are all highly advanced and should not be attempted without expert guidance and considerable experience in meditational techniques.